at the beginning of the month, the 7th of March, we looked at the journal article, or actually chapter, that Giannis and I wrote about academic integrity, in which we proposed a different way of doing when it comes to dealing with issues of academic integrity and academic misconduct through using the lenses of ethics of care and of restorative justice. So in the session thereafter, on the 14th of March, we talked a little bit more about, it was more a discussion and a thinking piece about how could ethics of care and restorative justice work in our spaces. So today we want to look a little bit more at just thinking about where we're going with this. So today's session is really very little about what I think about it, and very much about what people in the room think about it, and whether this is something that is practicable and applicable. So what we're going to do today is very much just focus on your own spaces. So it's really about thinking, how can we apply this in our specific spaces, and whether these two aspects, the ethics of care and the restorative practice, whether these things are useful and can be used in our different spaces. So what I'm going to ask you to do today is really think about it, maybe think back about, and that will be kind of our first activity for today, would be to think about instances of either academic misconduct or academic integrity that you've come across. I think it's easier maybe to think about misconduct, so maybe let's stick with that one. So how can we apply that to that situation? I think it would be nice if each person can pick a specific topic or a specific instance of misconduct that they feel very strongly about. In our previous session, there was some talk about in the clinical space what happens there. So maybe that is something that we could talk about. So I'm going to give everyone in the room just a few minutes, 5 or so minutes, to really just think about a specific instance of academic misconduct that they've come across in the past. So that's the first part. And then the second part of that is how could that instance of misconduct have worked out differently if either an ethics of care was applied to kind of the prior parts, because that's kind of where we're going with this, is and then the restorative practice is what happens after the misconduct has taken place. So I want you to think about a specific type of misconduct, how thinking about how things could have been structured differently, whether that would have had a positive effect that the misconduct didn't happen in the first place, or think about how things would work if for that specific type of misconduct, if a restorative practice approach is applied to it afterwards. So I'm going to go off camera now, and then we can, I'm also going to stop sharing my screen for a minute, and I'm going to give you 5 minutes to think about it, and then we'll get some feedback from the group. Okay, so I'm back. That was about 5 minutes. Does anybody have a scenario they would like to share with us, with the group? If not, I'll start us off with one, and then I'll hand over to the group um, to yeah, to bring us some further examples. So the scenario I have here is of Bill. He is an engineering one student, and the course is extremely difficult. It requires careful listening and reading of material, and thereafter thorough application to master the content. With the rapid move to online, so my example is situated in COVID. Bill is overwhelmed when he comes to campus virtually and he opens his course site. His lecturer has added many, 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 many readings, much more than was ever mentioned or referred to in any other sessions or in the course material or in the packs, etc. So there's also new things happening on the platform that wouldn't have happened in online in in-person classes, such as weekly quizzes, which they didn't, like I said, do during in-person sessions. Each quiz has several readings and videos and lectures attached to it, and the quiz is only available until the end of every week, then it disappears. Bill reaches out to some of his classmates to find out how they are coping, and he tries to find out if they are also overwhelmed by the amount of work they need to do. They decide to divide the work and that they will help each other out during the online quizzes to just get through it all in time before the quizzes disappear. So after some time, their lecturer notices that they log in and do the quizzes at the same time and that they score the same marks. And I think almost more importantly, get the same questions wrong. So the lecturer calls them in and accuses them of collusion, which is a form of academic misconduct. So the question is, we're just warming up here. So the question is, who is at fault for this? Do we say Bill is at fault for instigating group cheating or group collusion? Bill and his friends for actually doing the colluding work together? The lecturer for creating a heavy workload? Or is what is at fault kind of that almost helicopter parent-like feeling that we need to check on students learning more often in the online space than might be necessarily in the face-to-face space. So this is just an example. So I'll open up to the floor to think about in this specific example, and I'm using fault very loosely here. It's not necessarily that somebody did something wrong, but something that lead to a wrongful action. So who do we think is at fault in this type of situation? I'll open it up to the floor for inputs.
I think it's a combination
I think,
of lecturers
yes.
and students. Firstly, the lecturers should have been more open and communicative with the students, and so as the students with the lecturer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then, yeah, also when he found out, he should have also, or he or she should have actually contacted them and speak to them generally, asking what the problem is and why, before making any kind of decision on
Mm.
it as well. So yeah, that's and then the lecturer should have learned from that and changed different ways of doing it as well. And then
Yes.
also for me, create a
Mhm.
survey to find out from the rest of the class what
Mm.
the issues are.
Okay, great. Thanks, Adriano. I really appreciate that. Yeah, so there's more than one contributing factor to the situation. And that's the important thing, I think, when it comes to issues of misconduct, is that it's not an individualized thing where a student does something and therefore the student is the person at fault. There's an entire system um, creating pressure on the student, and there's all types of other factors. In this example, we have COVID as well, and the move to um, emergency remote teaching and learning. So there was a lot of uncertainties for a lot of people in this situation. So that's why I said I'm trying to be very loose with the idea of fault and wrongdoing at this point, because there are a lot of contributing factors. And I like what you mentioned, Adriano, about of doing kind of a survey and reaching out to students to find out what their experiences are, and maybe based on that some changes will need to be made. I think that links very nicely with the idea of the ethics of care, to make sure that we take care of our students and we don't overwhelm them and overburden them and create anxieties and things that are hopefully some of the things that we can move away from. So thank you for that. So based on this scenario, what could have been done differently if we think of the idea of ethics of care? Adriano has already mentioned something, but what else um, could have been done?
I think clear communication and clear communication lines to the students, to tell them what is expected and the rationale for this. And I think also if we look at what we expect of our students, we tell them in the real world you're going to work in teams and you're going to have to problem solve together, and then a problem emerge and they work together and they solved it together. Not talking about the cheating of the quizzes, but they actually did what we tried to teach them as the transferable skills, and now they are being punished for taking the initiative and applying these skills. So I think part of communicating the expectations is a huge thing here.
Yes, I can't agree more with you, Irene. I think that's definitely the case. So I also sometimes with the collusion one, I always feel bad about this one, because it is exactly what you say. We tell students that one of some of their graduate attributes is problem solving and working in teams and all of those really lovely ideals. And here they actually do it, and then we punish them for it. So there's maybe a misalignment sometimes, but like you said, the most important part of it is clear communication as to when something is acceptable and when it's not. And again, I think that links into the idea of the ethics of care. Is there anything else from the room about this specific point? Okay, so I'm taking the silence as no further points. So from the room, when we started the session, I asked you to think about your own kind of scenario of academic misconduct, and if we maybe had a different approach, how things might have been different. Would anybody like to share or should we use a general one again, like last week, not last week, but the last time we had the session, the clinical space came up as something that people are very worried about falsification of the logbooks, etc., or getting clinical practitioners to sign off on work that students actually didn't do. Should we talk ourselves through that scenario? Okay, so I'm getting a thumbs up from Irene, so let's do that one. So you'll have to help me here because I'm definitely not in the clinical space, and I sit in a faculty very much different from the medical faculty, health sciences. So I might go off kilter here. So the issue we are facing is that students sign or get people or get clinical practitioners to sign off on logbooks, or they might falsify it. So I think what our first question would be is kind of what leads to this behavior. I'm, so why do students do this? And again, I don't have the answers to this. So anyone, you're very welcome to come in at any time. You don't have to raise your hand, you can just start talking. So what are the factors that lead to this, to students doing these dishonest things? Adriano?
Could it be that firstly student workload,
Okay, so workload.
and then also access to these professionals to actually get it to sign off? Maybe they can't find it on the day, or the person on the day, and then they have to sort of make a plan from there to actually work it out. Or yeah, the other one is they're lazy and they don't want to do it. But that you can actually sort of solve with certain certain ways of getting them to sign, where it actually like a two-factor authentication type method. But yeah, so for me, it's just about location, accessibility, and workload.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Adriano. Anything else from the floor that, in your experience, can lead to this behavior in students?
I think maybe also that students do not understand that certain actions have consequences, and we want to believe that they are adults and they understand that there are consequences and that this is an ethical profession, but it is really a concern if they don't understand that. And it brings me back to the curriculum. Do we teach ethical conduct from day one in our curriculum? Is that one of our golden threads that we pull through the curriculum, or do we view this as an add-on that is just quickly whoop somewhere put into the curriculum, so just that we can tick the box and say, yes, we taught ethical behavior and professionalism to our students?
Yeah, Giannis.
So I agree with Irene, but also with Adriano, that I think the one thing is, well, ethical behavior, and that we don't really define what define misconduct for students. And the reason why I say that is the health system science honor students had a process mapping assignment, where they have to map out a process within a work setting. So this year I gave the students, because we've got challenges with bullying in the clinical spaces and so forth. So one group did like the departmental administration process, and one group did this bullying in the clinical spaces, to map out the challenges around that and why students don't escalate it. And what was very interesting about that, about the feedback that we got from this group, is that people's definition of bullying is different. And that goes back to the academic integrity as well, is that there's no consensus around what, what the bullying is. So I presume the same thing would be, there's no consensus around what exactly, classifies as falsification and classifies as, so that was one of the main things that they identified, is that we need to get our terminology right. But then I think the other thing that is a big issue is workload, like Adriano mentioned, but also that I think students think that they cannot be caught, especially because they move through different spaces and there's not one preceptor that, there's no eyes on them the whole time. And I think that's also what Irene kind of mentioned, it's a big issue if they don't know that this ethical conduct is wrong. And I don't think we should be policing them, but I think that is one of the other issues in terms of why. So it's workload on the one hand, knowing that I can get away with it on the other, and also not really understanding what the consequences are, but also what is really classified as cheating.
Sorry, I'm just making notes. That's great. Anything else that anyone wants to add to that? Okay.
Could I come in with a thought on what Jana
Yes.
said?
Yes.
Okay, the bullying and all that, okay, ethics and understanding it. But also at the same time, what Irene said is that we have to think that they are adults and critical thinkers, and these things should be more natural or already installed in them. It's a logical step of what you can do and what you can't do. So not understanding, for me, they know what they're doing, transgressing, on if they're going to transgress. When something it seems off or it doesn't seem right. The only time you would not know that psychologically is that herd mentality, whereas everybody else is doing it, so, and nothing's happened to them, so I can do it. So that's where I think is where the problem is. It's like, then also it becomes a collusion. If they can't find a solution that is ethical and all that, then okay, whose dad is a doctor? Who can actually forge documents well? So let's all do it. So then they can't really call out one person, or you can't call out anybody because it won't be visible. So I think it's in that vein, because I think everybody has that sense. And also when you start your studies, you have a sense of what is correct and what is not, especially after a while, after, spending a couple of months in first year or going into second year, you've seen you've seen a bit of what's happened, or you hear things or stuff like that. So yeah, it's a bit of education from the start on what it has to be. You always have to hold the hand on informing about this. But other than that, it's actually becomes more of a social thing. I don't know. It's a random thought that came into mind.
No, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. And I really want to pick up on that last part that you said where you said it becomes a social thing. And that can be a positive and a negative driver. But what Giannis and I have thought about in this chapter is that sense of society, your university community, your class community, your faculty community, or departmental, or whatever it might be. That being a positive driver, because when you have kind of those community values of what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, and when it's clear, of course, it's much easier to follow. Yeah, so that's just something that I wanted to pick up on from what was mentioned. So I think we have a lot of rich things here. So sorry, I'm a very pen and paper person, so I should have maybe typed this as people were talking so that we all had it on the screen in front of us. So I'm just going to pull a few things out as we're talking. So workload was something that came up as an issue. So if or the possibility of workload, we at this point we're not saying something is at fault or something is not at fault. So if workload is possibly an issue, how do we address this? What can we do to using either an ethics of care or restorative practice approach, what can we do differently to address that specific concern?
Sorry, me again. I've had too
Yeah,
much
go for
sugar
it.
and coffee. So yeah. My question would be, how many lecturers and staff actually communicate with each other and see who's doing what and that in their courses, and how to actually do, especially on ethics and all that, to tackle it together, because that's that community of practice where you come together and you work it out together and install it as a general practice throughout. Because if you go to one class and it's different, that's a different set of rules, and you go to another where it's confusing, and then that would also create that doubt or not understanding.
Okay, no, I agree with you. So, in this case, it's also clear communication between lecturers. So on that level, not just clear communication in the hierarchical way of down to students. Okay, so that's good. Anything else with workload that we can think about?
If I may,
Sure.
I think in many instances, and I'm talking from the clinical environment particularly, we don't teach our students about time management, and they're not used to the combination of a clinical workload onto which they've got to tag an academic responsibility. So again, we as educators have to define the boundaries and set the limits ab initio. And very definitely, and it's been my unfortunate experience, that a large number of our students have no good idea of time management in terms of what they must do in the ward, how that has to communicate, be conveyed to logbooks and completing assignments, on top of which they then have to plan to study around the subject. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Merwin, for that. Just to add on to that, in just a different space, from a meeting I had earlier today with people from business school about issues that they're also with time management seeing in their PhD cohorts, is that students don't realize when they, even PhD students don't realize when they kind of sign up for the PhD, the amount of hours they'll need to do. They think they sign up for a 3 or 4 year degree and it's going to be a relatively easy ride. But as the one person at business school mentioned, students don't realize that that means that's at least a 5,000 hour commitment spread across those study years that you are actually agreeing to. So, and then the time management also becomes an issue because they can't juggle those extra 5,000 hours with their work life as well. So I understand where you're coming from. Anything else? I see Jan has put in the chat. I think this one plays a big part. Examples of role models from Irene. Yes, I think that also plays a good part. So could role models, etc., be something that can help students on various levels, like hypothetically, as we're talking about workload now, could that be somebody, or that could help in that regard as well?
I think when I talk about role models, I think I'm more meant the bad role models, where they see dishonesty happening in the clinical area, and they see one do one teach one, so they see that they get away with these unethical behavior, and it just snowball and escalate. That if there's no consequences for the role models there, then they can also do the same.
That's a good point. Thanks, Irene, for clarifying. So, models.
Yeah, so just on that, I really agree with Irene. I think that does play a big part because, like, yet again, just going back to the bullying, the same reason why there's bullying in the spaces is that people, replicate the same behaviors that they've seen as how they were, when they were students. So the and there's, because it's such a fast-paced environment and difficult and hard. I think people take shortcuts and so forth, and obviously students pick that up in the clinical spaces. So yeah, so I think role modeling does play a big role as well.
Thanks, Jonas. Okay. Okay, so another thing that was mentioned was access to professionals, it's especially with maybe signing off logbooks, etc. Again, I'm not in the clinical space. Is it difficult for students to find the people who are supposed to sign off their books and make sure that they have actually done the work in the clinical space that they are recording in their books? I'm actually not sure. Is it difficult?
It's very variable depending on the clinical space. In the majority of instances, medical students are exposed or work with many junior people, and the junior people have obviously a massive workload. They're literally carrying the can. And so they approach these junior people to sign off on projects or procedures, and the junior people they approach don't have the perspective as to how to evaluate these projects. So they're getting evaluated by people who are really not equipped to assess them properly, which creates then a false sense of security for our students. So we then have another responsibility, and that's from the seniors in the workspace. And now I'm not talking about undergrads, I'm talking about postgrads who are already working in the hospital environment. It would be up to the seniors to try and educate the juniors as to how to be responsible for these evaluations and assessments. So Irene's point that she made earlier about this whole delegation, hierarchical, educational approach leads to the role model at the top, who actually sets the standards. I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
No, I'm following you 100%. Thanks for that information. It's so what I'm seeing here is, and we haven't even gone through all of the points, and we might not be able to go through all of the points because we have 20 minutes left in the session, but The feeling I'm getting is that it is a multifaceted problem. So if we look at just the sign-off and the access to professionals, and that it's usually junior people, and we all know when you start a new job, junior people most probably do have massive workloads because they still need to prove themselves. And then for them to just cope, they might just sign off on things, not even maybe looking at what the students said they did. And that could have a negative follow through to the role models, in the sense that then students know which overburdened junior people to ask for sign-offs, because those people won't question anything, because they also are just trying to get through their days. So all of these things seem to be very much interlinked, actually. Yeah, so let's look at one more thing, and I'm sorry that Irene has now left the session, but she mentioned that ethical conduct, and I think that's incredibly important, and that it is something that should be a golden thread that pulls through, and that links kind of with what's not kind of, it links completely with what Jan has mentioned about kind of the consensus about what misconduct and what different types of misconduct does mean. So I'm going to put those two together for now.
While you're doing that, may I make a comment?
Yes, please.
And I'm again talking from the clinical space, that we get a whole lot of students growing up in the profession, but nobody's actually sat down with them and explained to them about ethical conduct. We just assume that people inherently know right from wrong, but in the medical environment, ethics has a very special connotation in terms of privacy and punctuality and courtesy, and these are all ethical considerations, behavioral considerations, and I don't think we put enough emphasis in the primary education to the very junior people as to the significance of this behavioral attitude. Thanks.
No, again, thanks so much, Merwin. And I think I'm learning a lot more during this session than anyone is from me, because ethics in my head is a little bit more general than that. Ethical conduct, like you said, knowing what's right and what's wrong, what's the right way to act, what's the wrong way to act. But you're right, it has a much more nuanced meaning in the spaces that the students need to go into. And so how do we, I think another issue then might be is, do students conflate these two, although they are complementary and technically can be one thing, but it is two sets of values linked just to different spaces, like you mentioned before about the academic and the clinical workload. So there's an ethical conduct in the academic sense when we talk about misconduct, and ethical conduct when it comes to actually working in the clinical space. So the question then is, do students conflate these two things? That would be one of my questions. They might think that ethics in the academic sense is not that big of a deal, because turn it in doesn't catch you, or this or that. So then if it's not a big deal in the academic space, then it's most probably also not a big deal in the clinical space, which is, of course, in both cases completely wrong. But in the clinical space, it has much wider and more serious repercussions, I would say, if they get that ethical conduct wrong.
Well, just to elaborate a little bit on that, and then on getting it wrong. It's like when Richard and I, or Brock Cook and I, were busy writing the second part about academic integrity in the clinical space. I mean, the one thing that we wrote is that, you know, if that students not seeing clinical cases where they signed off on that actually has an implication on patient safety in the future, etc. So, or patient care. So it does have you know, it's not just about being ethical. In the end, it also impacts patient care, and that makes it, you know, a big ethical issue around being dishonest.
Yeah, wow. Thanks for that, Giannis. I think that it just underlines how serious this actually is. So with the amount of time we have on the clock, I'm not going to go through the other ones as well. So what we have on the screen now, I want us to, let me just see if I can make this a little bigger. With what we have on the screen now, so what would be, how could we apply just to these four aspects that we have on the screen? How could we apply an ethics of care? Giannis, is that a new hand or a previously used hand?
Sorry, old one.
Great, thank you. So I know it's a difficult question. But how could we apply an ethics of care if we just look at what's on the screen at the moment? How can we do things differently?
Communicate more effectively.
Yeah, thanks, Adriano. And Giannis?
So I think sort of building on what Mervyn was saying around the well, is sort of understanding, you know, why are students being dishonest, and then part of that in ethics of care would be to train the juniors, you know, how to deal with issues of academic integrity and so forth, and then like Adriana mentioned, communication. But I think the first part is to, you know, speak to students and understand what are the challenges that they are faced with in the clinical space, that leads to the dishonesty, and then thinking through support mechanisms.
Sorry again, I have this terrible disease where I can't speak and write at the same time. So yeah, I like what you mentioned, Giannis, and I think it is practicable, and it does lead into the idea of the ethics of care. So understanding why this happens, why do students do this? Also, like you said, to train your junior professionals to better assess these types of things, and to interact with maybe the logbooks in a more nuanced way, and to understand the challenges of students, and to link that through to support, I think is very important. And what Adriano mentioned as well about the communication, I think is very important. And that goes in all directions, not just, and I don't like to talk in hierarchies, but I am going to do that now, not just down to students, but also across between Sorry, I just saw Adriano's comment and had to laugh. Yes, if somebody can diagnose and help me with my disease, it would be fantastic. So communication down is important to students so that they understand, but also communication across, not just across lecturers, but also between lecturers and the academic spaces and the clinical spaces. And all of that could be linked to an ethics of care. And I'm mindful of the time, so I'm not going to go into more depth with this question, because I also want to ask the question about the restorative practice. So if these things do happen, how do we respond? If we do see students targeting specific junior professionals to sign off on their books, or that they are overloaded and they do falsify their logbooks, how do we respond?
I think that has to be done at two levels. It has to be done at the level of the student and at the level of the junior, and it has to be done as two separate events. I think we must approach the student and explain what has been done and what the repercussions may be. And then we have to approach the juniors very privately and very individually and explain that their responsibility, and it's basically part of our primary oath that we are there to teach. Teaching is part of healing. And yes, we are sensitive to their workloads. We've all been there and we've all had to do it. But the extra 5 minutes spent in helping an upcoming colleague to learn the right way is a very valuable lesson. And as I mentioned earlier, this training has to be done ab initio, from the time the students get exposed to the clinical environment, so that they, by the time they get to the junior status, they're already aware of their responsibility to be conscientious, diligent, and the big word is caring. And just to comment on Adriano's note, I think much as medieval torture techniques would work, one of the things that we have to do is explain to students that they've actually got to look at themselves, which is something that they don't know how to do. They don't know how to look inside and say, is this okay? If it's not okay, why not? And if not, why? How can I make it better? So we've got a massive responsibility, and it starts from day one as they enter the clinical environment. And it should never stop. It should never stop. Even as seniors, and we've grown through the system, we are responsible for making sure that the people with whom we work and for whom we are responsible know how to look at themselves and make things better. Thanks.
Yeah. No, thanks so much, Mervyn. I think, wow, I have nothing to add there. It is an immense responsibility, and I appreciate the way that you have unpacked it, and I think that is the only way to do it. Janus.
So, yet again, I agree with Mervyn around the introspection of students, and I think one of the so a recent case that we had of plagiarism, I kind of thought through the restorative practice process a bit, and I think it was also Mervyn that mentioned the time management issues in the clinical space, and the one thing we ask the student to do is to reflect on their dishonesty. Why were they dishonest? How does this impact patients? How does it impact the health system? And how will they put together a plan to develop honesty, integrity, and to restore trust with their fellow students and clinicians and so forth. So yeah, so I think one component of restorative practice should be reflection and doing introspection around how you can do that. But there was just another thing I also wanted to agree with Mo, and it's not about the restorative practice, but the around what he mentioned, the oath, and that teaching forms such a big component, and it's one of the things that kind of always shocks me around research we've done on faculty development, where people say, I'm a clinician, I'm not a teacher. And it kind of speaks to a big issue in the where I've been thinking around undergraduate education, where we need to really forefront that teacher identity, with mentorship, and because teaching, as Merwin mentioned, it actually happens from your first year up till when you're a clinician. You will be training registrars, etc. Training and learning and teaching forms a big part of it, yet we don't forefront it in the curriculum, and we don't train students around dealing with that. So it's really a cultural thing. We would also need to look at a cultural shift around academic integrity, to make this work.
Yeah, thanks, Jonas, and I really appreciate the example you gave with the student who plagiarized, and because all of the things that you've mentioned, how what the student had to do, the reflection and the introspection, and also thinking about how it has affected the people around them, it is really, for me, in essence, what the restorative practice approach is about. So I absolutely adore that example. But I think you and Merwin touched on a very important thing about making teaching others part of our students' identities and part of their coursework. Or not coursework, degree in some way, if it's part of the hidden curriculum or whatever we want to call it. Because I think we can all learn from each other, and if we have an open mind to it, then we can really be useful, and hopefully then turn those negative role models into positive role models. And with the last 2 minutes, I'm going to leave you with a question to ponder on by yourself. And the question is, if we go back to the beginning, very, very beginning, are we building castles in the sky? That's my last question. If we take this approach, is it something that we could actually do? Or is it just nice ideas that we have and we should continue with things as they are? But if we're not happy with the status quo and how things are going, and this isn't an option, what is an option? So that's my last question for you to think about for today. So thank you so much for having me for these 3 sessions. I really appreciate it. Let me turn on my camera one last time. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It was, for me, invigorating to engage with you on these issues and to talk through what could possibly or maybe work in these spaces. So thank you so much for having me. And Jonas, is there anything you would like to say about what comes next after this session? Then I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Marika. Just on your last question about castles in the sky, I think one of the important things about higher education is that it is the last safe space for for students, and rather than to vilify them, I think we need kinder approaches to deal with it, and that also yet again speaks to the bullying component, because because students do replicate behaviors that they've seen in at university. So if we take kinder approaches, they would hopefully replicate those same approaches in the clinical spaces and so forth. And in that way, we can work on the changing the culture of the health system.
Yes.
But in terms of the way forward, so the next sessions we are going to focus on the student lecturer contract, which would be run by Prof. Cook. But I think before that, we're just doing a session on the teaching portfolio next week. So please, and I think that will be run by Christine, but she'll probably send out the marketing details within the next few days. And then Marika, just once again, thank you so much for presenting these 3 sessions. I think it was really interesting, and it's such an important topic, especially as people are now actually talking a lot more about it around AI and so forth. I think it's really become an even more important topic. Not that it's always been, but I think it's becoming an even bigger critical topic.
Thanks so much, Johannes. I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate that too.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Marika. Bye, everybody.